Dynamite Law for El Dorado. Complete book-length masked writer novel by Walker A. Tompkins. Chapter 1. $5,000 reward. Facetious miners named the lofty redwood tree the world's largest bulletin board, for the reason that California lawmen had utilized it since the days of '49 as a spot to nail up vigilante notices, reward posters, and similar placards. It was not a large specimen, as redwoods went in the Wawona section of the Sierra Nevadas, being only some 30 feet in circumference at the butt. And a prehistoric lightning bolt had burned out the heart of the bowl, so that riders and mule strings, packing bullion out of the gold camp at Placer Bar, could ride through the fissure in the trunk. Situated on the rim rock of Roaring River's south bank, the bulletin board tree marked the junction of trails branching out to Hornitas and Mariposa to the south, Big Oak Flat and Placerville to the north, and the trail which was straddled by the redwood's fire-scarred trunk, the Roaring Boom Camp 5 miles up the river canyon, Placer Bar. For 2 generations, mother lode sheriffs had tacked reward posters to the thick, fibrous bark. Back in the "Get your arms up," Betty challenged. "I've got you covered." Chapter 12. The masked rider and Blue Hawk ride into Fetes. Joaquin Murrieta and Three Finger Jack had reined up before the redwood to fire their 6-shooters at blazers, offering a reward for their capture. Pony Express riders headed for Sacramento and San Francisco with their mochilas bulging with overland mail, had hurtled through the cleft tree in '61. There was a saying in the El Dorado country that if you camped long enough at Bulletin Board Tree, you would meet every gold hunter, gambler, desperado, and adventurer who was lured to California's gold fields. 2 riders, trailing pack horses, were heading at a leisurely pace up the Placer Bar Trail on this balmy summer afternoon, bound for the heart of the Sierra Nevadas. They came from the direction of Sonora and Ruby Crater, and no traveler meeting them on the trail now would have guessed that vigilante posses were still combing the northern reaches of the mother lode in search of them. Wayne Morgan, mounted on a deep brisketed roan cow pony, was oddly out of place against the mountain background, for he wore the bat-wing chaps, cleft-crown Stetson, and spurred mule-ear boots of a buckaroo from, say, Texas or Wyoming. Trailing the roan without benefit of hackamore rope was a magnificent black stallion carrying Morgan's warsack and bedroll. The cowboy's saddle partner was a Yaqui Indian, dressed in a white cotton shirt and buff drill trousers, his feet encased in pliable deerskin moccasins. A single eagle feather jutted from his coal-black braided hair, held in place by a scarlet bandeau. The puma-muscled red man rode a wiry gray horse, while his pack mare was paint. This pinto served for a saddle mount when the Yaqui was not riding the gray. "The Bulletin Board Tree, Hawk," commented Wayne Morgan, cuffing back his gray Stetson and scanning the dozens of overlapping reward posters which had been nailed like shingles around the circumference of the sequoia tree. "The last time we was here, remember? We had no time to rubberneck. If I remember right, a sheriff from Jimtown was breathing down our necks with a couple of hang ropes hanging over his pommel." Blue Hawk, the Yaqui, reined up alongside his partner's stirrup, his flint-black eyes flashing humorously in recollection of the last time they had galloped up this trail. "You remember well, senor," chuckled the Indian. "But you have another reason for stopping here this morning, no?" Morgan nodded, his blue-gray eyes slitting as they searched the array of posters. In his early 30s, Morgan sat his saddle as if he had been born in the cannelboard. His bronzed hands never strayed far from the staghorn butts of the Colt 45 6-guns which reposed in thong-down holsters at his thighs. "It is well we did tarry here before riding into Placer Bar this evening, Honk," he commented. "Looks like the hombre that's been hanging around here calling himself the Masked Rider, and we had to sashay over here to see about, has been plumb busy. See yonder." The Indian followed the direction of Morgan's pointing arm. Tacked above the V-shaped notch in the split redwood was a big cardboard poster which gleamed white as havoc reigns when sidewinders plan a big. California to settle some salty hombres. Smashed back with slugs in their chests, the two gunmen reeled over the cliff's brink, Chapter 1, bone against the weather-yellowed placards around it. Sun rays, shafting down through the conifers which timbered Roaring River Canyon, glinted blindingly off the heads of nails which held the poster, proof that they had been driven there but a short time before. The night dews had not yet rusted the nails. The faces of the two riders sobered as they read the latest poster to be nailed to the redwood. $5,000 reward for the capture, alive, of the outlaw who is called the Masked Rider will be paid by the undersigned. Rides a coal-black stallion named Midnight, dresses in a black cape, a black Stetson, and wears a black domino mask. Travels with a Yaqui Indian named Blue Hawk, who has been educated in mission schools and is a dead shot with a firearm or bow and arrow, wanted dead or alive. Believed to be in El Dorado country, headed for Nevada. James Endicott, Sheriff, Calaveras County, California. "You are right, senor," grunted Blue Hawk, gathering up his reins. "We need provisions. It is best that I hole up in the brush, senor, while you ride on to Placer Gap in your Wayne Morgan disguise. The law at the mining camp will not guess you." Dinero killing on the Eagle Mining Syndicate. Are the real famous Robin Hood outlaw this sheriff thinks this other man to be, and calls the Masked Rider. Morgan grinned boyishly as he reined his roan saddler through the cleft redwood. During the years he and the Yaqui had ridden the Owl Hoot Trail, no man had ever discovered the dual identity of Wayne Morgan and the celebrated Masked Rider. Only when playing the role of the West's Robin Hood fugitive did Wayne Morgan don the black mask and Stetson and cloak by which evildoers knew the Vengeance Rider. As long as someone calling himself the Masked Rider has been in this country, even though now we know he has hightailed, Morgan agreed, it would be dangerous for us to be seen riding together into this mining camp, or the Robin Hood outlaw reined up sharply as a high-pitched scream came to his ears from somewhere dead ahead on the canyon rim trail. Even as he dropped a hand to gun butt, Wayne Morgan saw a rider hurtle into view around a bend of the trail 50 yards east of the bulletin board tree. The rider was bent low over the saddle horn and quirting a galloping sorrel pony for extra speed. An instant later, the rumble of hoofbeats was drowned out by the roar of a heavy-calibered rifle. Morgan and Blue Hawk saw the sorrel pony go down in mid-stride, tunneled by a .30-30 slug. Catapulted from stirrups, the rider flew through space to land in a dense bed of ferns by the trail side, the slain horse crashing off into the canyon and hurtling 50 feet to the boiling rapids of the river below. Spurring swiftly into the undergrowth alongside the trail, Wayne Morgan was leaping from saddle even as 3 burly riders charged into view and halted their rearing ponies alongside the ferns where the rider had fallen. Another scream came from the unhorsed rider then, just as Blue Hawk was leading his 2 ponies into the brush. The two partners of the owl hoot exchanged dumbfounded glances as they realized that the rider was a girl. Peering through the screen of jungle-thick growth, Morgan and Blue Hawk saw the three whiskery-faced riders swing out of stirrups and pounce upon the girl, even as she scrambled to her feet. Then, for the first time, the hidden outlaws saw that the girl's pursuers wore bandanas tied over their faces. With feverish haste, Wayne Morgan unbuckled his saddlebags and removed therefrom his black Stetson and cloak. "Keep under cover with the hosses, Hawk," he ordered, swiftly donning his domino mask. "Three roughs holding up a lone girl. It don't stack up so good. I aim to see what's going on out there." With practiced skill, Wayne Morgan transformed himself into the mysterious masked rider, while Blue Hawk kept watch of what was transpiring on the trail. The girl was still struggling frantically, but she was being bound and gagged by her bandana-masked assailants. Whipping back his sable-hued cloak, the masked rider palmed a .45 peacemaker and slithered off through the manzanitas and sumac brush which paralleled the trail. But by the time he had reached the spot where the masked trio had shot the girl's horse from under her, the kidnap victim was securely tied up, her arms behind her back, a handkerchief knotted around her jaws to silence her cries. "We're settin' purty, boys," exulted one of the trio, rubbing his hands together gleefully. "When Ed Shannon finds out we've got his girl, he'll be glad to fork over that payroll dinero. When we got the money, we'll cash in her chips and—" The outlaw broke off with a startled oath as he heard a crashing sound in the brush behind him. Whirling, the kidnapper froze in a posture of horror as he saw a black-clad apparition stalk out of the fernbrake behind a pair of jutting colts. "Elevate, hombres," drawled the masked rider. "Pronto!" The two Mackinaw-coated ruffians who were in the act of hoisting the girl aboard one of the horses spun about, releasing their grip on the prisoner's arms. It's the masked rider, Chief," groaned one of the masked men. "We got to shoot our way out of this, or our fish is fried." Moving as one, the two outlaws dug for leather. Sun rays flashed on darting gunmetal as the killers whipped their .45s to a level, aiming at the poised figure of the masked rider. With a grim smile, the black-clad man tripped gun hammers. Flames spat from the bores of his peacemakers. The river's thunder was drowned out by the deafening roar of the masked rider's lethal revolvers. Smashed back with slugs in their chests, the two gunmen reeled into the trailside brush and pitched out of sight over the cliff's brink to plunge to their dooms in the boiling white water 50 feet below. Through whirling gun smoke, the masked rider saw the remaining outlaw leap to put the girl between himself and the black-hatted gunman. With a bellow of terror, the surviving member of the kidnapped trio vaulted into saddle and wheeled his pony about in the direction of Placer Bar. Unable to shoot without endangering the tied-up girl, the masked rider charged forward as he saw the bandit roll his hooks. A dangling pine branch clawed at the outlaw's bandana mask in that instant, and for a fleeting moment, the masked rider caught sight of the whiskery-jowled, hate-contorted face behind the leader's mask. He saw a shoebrush pompadoured Germanic bullet head. Then the bandit was gone around the hairpin bend of the trail. The masked rider suppressed an oath of fury as he heard the swift rataplan of hoofbeats as the would-be kidnapper made his escape up the canyon trail. Chapter 2. The girl from Placer Bar. Thrusting his smoke-fuming colts into holsters, the masked rider strode across the trail and reached up to remove the handkerchief gag from the girl's mouth. And as the cloth fell away, he looked down into a blanched white face, which he knew would be beautiful under less trying circumstances. The kidnapped victim was hardly more than 19 or 20, with a wealth of wheat gold hair and eyes as blue and lustrous as a mountain pool. She wore a miner's red flannel shirt and buckskin foxed riding breeches tucked into taffy brown boots. But even the masculine garb could not hide the full, supple curves of her lovely body. Except for a turquoise and silver-handled skinning knife in a sheath at her belt, the girl was unarmed. Her slim hands were encased in fringed buckskin gauntlets, and in lieu of a hat, she wore a blood-red rose in her hair. "Thank you, sir," she panted, color glowing back into her face as she saw her benefactor remove the Bowie knife from her scabbard and use the razor-keen blade on the hemp rope with which the outlaws had bound her arms behind her. You are the masked rider?" As the girl's bonds fell in loops at her feet and the Robin Hood outlaw restored her knife to its case, the tall, domino-masked man nodded gravely. "You have good ears." He laughed. "The two fiends who identified me, I fear, will not be able to congratulate their partner on making his escape. You got any idea who them men were? They must have believed you'd know 'em, else they wouldn't have masked up." The girl shook her head, busy peeling off her gloves to chafe her bruised wrists. "No," she whispered, shuddering. I was out taking my usual twilight ride out of Placer Bar when they jumped me back along the trail. They told me to throw up my hands and rain down. I decided to run for it." Steel-shod hoofs grated on the trail behind them, and the masked rider whirled, hands going gunward. Then he relaxed as he saw Blue Hawk striding toward them, with the 4 horses at his heels. "My partner," the masked rider reassured the girl. "Did you see the face of that hombre who escaped when the pine limb brushed off his mask?" She shook her head. "No, I was staring at you," she confessed, and her laugh reminded the 2 outlaws of water rippling over a cascade. "But I should introduce myself. I am Betty Noonan. I teach school up at Placer Bar." The masked rider walked over to inspect the 2 lather-flecked horses belonging to the kidnappers who had been bullet-dumped into Roaring River's chasm. The saddles bore no distinguishing marks, and the horses were unbranded. "You're wondering why I was waylaid, masked rider," Betty Noonan said. "I think I can tell you." The masked rider waited for the young schoolteacher to go on. "I think it is because I am Ed Channon's fiancée," she said confidently. "You see, Ed is the payroll clerk for the Big Eagle Mining Syndicate. He handles large amounts of money to pay off the syndicate miners. I think those 3 ruffians wanted to hold me for ransom, believing that Ed might be tempted to hand over the monthly payroll to them to redeem my life." The masked rider rubbed his smooth-shaven jaw thoughtfully. "The sun will be setting in another hour," he said. "I don't think it would be wise for you to borrow one of these horses and ride back to the men in camp alone, Miss Noonan. Not with that Lobo at large. He might try to capture you on your way back." Betty Noonan tugged on her gauntlets and flashed a smile at the stolid-faced Blue Hawk. "I understand," she said. "You want to escort me safely home, but you wouldn't dare enter Placer Bar until after dark. Is that it?" The masked rider nodded. "If you don't feel nervous about waiting here with us," he began apologetically. Betty Noonan's eyes sparkled with merriment. "I think it would be romantic to visit with the West's most famous gentleman desperado," she said. "I am sure Mr. Channon would want me to accept your kind offer of protection." Withdrawing to a shadowy glade out of sight of the miners' trail, the 3 settled down to wait for dusk. But the comely schoolma'am made no attempt to question her benefactors. They in turn maintained a tight-lipped silence regarding their reasons for being in the gold country. Chagnon was hanging by his wrists over the shaft. Chapter 13. Night fell swiftly in the tall timber, and the girl saw the two oddly contrasting outlaws strip saddles from their mounts and stake out the roan and the pinto. Then the masked rider saddled Midnight, his coal-black stallion, while Blue Hawk rigged his gray. Sheltered by the pitch darkness, the three made their way back to the roaring river trail. Betty Noonan, mounted on one of the slain outlaws' horses, spurred into the lead to guide her rescuers along the zigzagging trail. 4 miles to the eastward, a turn in the canyon revealed the clustering lights of the boom camp. Saloon windows were ablaze with light along the main street, which followed the riverbank along the pit of the gulch. Higher up the pine-hung slopes, lights glowed in the windows of miners' shacks. To the right of the trail, as they rode into the outskirts of Placer Bar, the smokestacks and rough outlines of mine shaft houses were sharp-etched against the starry sky. These buildings are the smelters and stamp mills of the Eagle Syndicate, Betty Noonan explained to the riders who flanked her either stirrup. My fence is in the syndicate office. I will stop there, and Ed can take me down to the boarding house where I live during the school term. The three dismounted in the clot of shadows below the Eagle Mining Syndicate's big reduction mill. Its noisy stamping machinery was stilled, following a day's work of pounding the gold-bearing ore, which miners grubbed from the rich Motherlode hills surrounding the mining settlement. You needn't fear Ed Shannon will turn you in to the regulators here in town, sir, Betty Noonan said, as she swung gracefully out of stirrups. Won't you come in and let my future husband thank you personally? ROR. The first time since they had left their hideout, the masked rider's taut muscles relaxed. At any point along the roaring river trail, he had expected a gunshot to stab the darkness. It surprised him that the outlaw who had escaped the threat of his blazing .45S back at the bulletin board redwood tree had not lain in wait for Betty Noonan, knowing she would be returning home sooner or later by the only trail leading to Placer Bar. Yeah, we would be glad to meet the lucky man, the masked rider told the girl, hardly knowing why he made his decision. Make sure, though, that Shannon is alone in his office. He might have visitors who know of the bounty Blue Hawk and I are packing on our top knots. The masked rider spoke facetiously, but already Blue Hawk had stolen up to the lighted office window and was peering inside. A tall, strikingly handsome young clerk was busy at a desk inside, and seated in a chair near the door was a gray-whiskered man with a toothpick waggling from his lips. He was engaged in conversation with Ed Shannon. Stepping up beside Blue Hawk, Betty Noonan glanced inside the syndicate office and smiled reassuringly. That other man is Ed's best friend, Gus Asplund, she whispered. He's the salt of the earth, a stamp mill engineer here at the plant. You won't have to worry about him. A moment later, Betty Noonan was stepping into the office with the masked rider and Blue Hawk at her heels. "Betty!" cried the young payroll clerk, springing up with a glad smile illuminating his clean-cut, rugged features. "I've been worried about you staying out so long. Ed Shannon's face bleached of color, and his hand stabbed toward a 6-gun holstered at his thigh as he caught sight of his fancy's companions. Gus Asplund bounced out of his chair and hurled his arms aloft as he stared at the masked rider and Blue Hawk. Unarmed, the stamp mill engineer was taking no chances. "These men saved my life down by the bulletin board tree this afternoon, darling," Betty Noonan said, laughing. "Put away that gun. When you hear what they did for me—" Ed Shannon's face dripped sweat. He held his 6-gun half out of holster, his face twitching with mixed emotions. But that's the masked rider and his engine pard, croaked the payroll clerk. Marshal Pedersen and the town regulators have been warned to watch out for them. The mixed fear and concern vanished from Ed Shannon's face as his fancy briefly outlined the circumstances of her near kidnapping and the providential appearance of the masked rider. Tomorrow, we can scout along the river and try to identify the two dead men, the girl concluded. My attackers could be any one of 100 lawless men here in Placer Bar, Ed, and one of them is still at large. I'm sure they had their eye on the payroll currency you keep in the syndicate safe yonder. Crossing to the window and pulling down a green shade to make sure no passerby caught sight of his guests, Ed Shannon turned to pump the hands of the masked rider and Blue Hawk. Not until then did the engineer, Gus Asplund, lower his arms. Ignoring the payroll clerk's stammering words of gratitude, the masked rider jerked a thumb toward the small iron safe behind Shannon's desk, marked in gold letters, Eagle Mining Syndicate. Miss Noonan says your payroll dinero is in greenbacks, the Robin Hood outlaw said bluntly. How long will that money be kept in that sardine can you call a safe, Mr. Shannon? For an instant, suspicious lights kindled in the payroll clerk's eyes as his brain quested for the motive back of the masked rider's question. Then he flushed guiltily. Payday is a week from tomorrow, he said. Why do you ask? The eyes behind the domino mask hardened. If that payroll money was back of Miss Noonan's attempted kidnapping this afternoon, the masked rider pointed out seriously, another and straighter try may be made to get it, Shannon. If I was you, I'd take precautions against having that safe blown open one of these nights by some El Dorado burglar. Shannon, one arm encircling his future bride as if he never wanted her to leave his presence again, scowled uncertainly. What would you suggest, masked rider? The Robin Hood outlaw's eyes ranged across the room to where several cases of dynamite and blasting powder were stored. I'd fill the extra space in that safe with dynamite, he said, and hang a label beside the combination dial informing a would-be safecracker what you've done. He might think you was bluffing, but if he did blow open the safe, he'd probably get killed trying it, and at least the payroll money wouldn't fall into his hands. It would be blown to shreds. A grin broke over the young clerk's face. I'll do just that, he said impulsively. You see, safes have to be toted into these mountains on muleback, so we couldn't get a decent-sized vault for storing the syndicate's funds. Gus Asplund, in the background, cleared his throat. Reckon I'll be moseying along to supper, Ed, the engineer said. I'm sure proud to have met you, masked rider, and your engine pard. We think a heap of Miss Betty here in Placer Bar, and we won't be soon forgetting what you done for her today. Asplund shook hands with the two outlaws, and tipping his shapeless hat to Betty Noonan, slipped out into the night. Once away from the Eagle Syndicate buildings, Asplund broke into a run. Reaching the main street of the mining camp, he lumbered his way to a side street and followed it up the south slope of the gulch until he came to the red brick jailhouse. There, the mining camp marshal, Russ Pedersen, maintained the headquarters of the Placer Bar regulators. The syndicate engine boss was panting with exertion as he rapped on the jailhouse door. It was opened by the beefy-shouldered, onion-balled tin star, Marshal Pedersen. Rustle the regulators together in a hurry, Marshal, gasped Asplund breathlessly. If you get over to Shannon's office before they leave, you'll be able to dab your loop on the masked rider and his redskin partner, Blue Hawk. Chapter 3. We want the masked rider. USS Pedersen made a spluttering sound, which indicated that Asplund's news had caused him to swallow his cud of tobacco. "The heck you say, Gus?" ejaculated the regulator chief. "You must be tight or loco." Asplund crowded into the jail office, his hands trembling with excitement. "It's the truth, I tell you," protested the engineer. "I just come from there. The Masked Rider and Blue Hawk palaverin' with Ed Shannon. They may leave town airy minute." Pedersen sniffed Asplund's breath, detected no whiskey on it, then tugged at his sandy waterfall mustache dubiously. "Why in the name of blazes," he demanded, "would a man like Ed Shannon be pow-wowing with the Masked Rider? If this is one of your practical jokes, Gus Asplund, I'll wring your turkey neck for you." Asplund grabbed the lawman's sleeves frantically. "I ain't joking," he pleaded. "Surround the Eagle office with enough regulators, Pedersen, and you'll capture them bandits alive. There's a $5,000 reward on the Masked Rider's scalp, and it'll be payable to me if I'm telling you the truth, won't it?" Convinced of Asplund's sincerity, Russ Pedersen jerked a ring of keys from his Levi's pocket and unlocked a gun locker on the office wall. "Get going, Gus," rasped the marshal. "Spread the word, but don't let the saloon riffraff find out what's in the wind. Fetch 15, 20-odd regulators up here, and I'll pass out shotguns enough to go around. And rattle your hocks, you spavin little donkey engine nurse." In an incredibly short time, Gus Asplund returned to the hillside jail, with 13 members of the town regulators with him, burly, rock-eyed men, owners of mines and saloons, and other business enterprises. They had banded together to maintain law and order in the settlement under the leadership of their hard-riding, straight-shooting marshal, Russ Pedersen. "We'll throw a cordon around Shannon's office shack, men." Pedersen gave his battle orders as he passed out double-barreled buckshot guns to the excited regulators. "Kill the engine if he makes a break for it, but don't forget, I want the Masked Rider alive. Wounded, maybe, but in good enough shape to qualify for the reward he's packing." Like a file of ghosts, Pedersen and his scattergun-toting regulators, accompanied by Gus Asplund, hurried through the night in the direction of the Eagle stamp mills. They purposely avoided the main street below so that the alarm would not spread to the saloon element. Moving swiftly to their appointed places, the regulators flung a cordon around the frame shack, which was Ed Shannon's syndicate office. Then, palming his 6 guns for action, Russ Pedersen headed grimly for the door of Shannon's office. Holstering one gun, Pedersen reached for the doorknob, twisted it, found it locked. Glancing around, the mining camp marshal saw 3 horses ground-tied in a patch of blue-stem grass, off at the edge of the timber where the Roaring River Trail entered the gulch. One of them, a coal-black stallion, was almost invisible in the starlight. "That'll be the Masked Rider's bronc," thought Pedersen. "He ain't flew the coop yet, then." Reaching up, Pedersen rapped the door panel sharply with the muzzle of his 6-gun. A bullet from one of the Masked Rider's .45s found the marshal's cheek. Chapter 3. From within came Ed Shannon's startled voice, after a short delay. "Who is it?" Pedersen braced his muscles grimly, thumb-earing his knurled gun hammer to full cock. "The regulators! We want the Masked Rider, Ed!" Pedersen heard a girl's voice give a sharp, low cry inside Shannon's office. Then, after a pause, Shannon's voice again. "Gus Asplund told you the Masked Rider was here, eh? The dirty scum." Pedersen's heart tom-tommed in his ears. "Open up, Shannon, before we bash the door down. Your visitors can't get away. The regulators got the building surrounded." Pedersen heard the payroll clerk's harsh breathing behind the door panels. They've gone, Marshal," faltered Shannon. "The Masked Rider and Blue Hawk vamoosed 5 minutes ago. Nobody's in here but Betty and me." Pedersen kicked the door savagely with a hobnailed boot. "Open up, cuss you, or I'll hold you as an accessory, Ed," thundered the marshal. "You're going to have plenty explaining to do about the masked rider visiting you, as it is." Inside the syndicate office, Betty Noonan, white-faced with anxiety, was unlocking a door in the rear of the shack. At her back was the masked rider and Blue Hawk, their jaws hard with determination as they saw Ed Channon exchanging comments with the law officer at the doorstep. "In here," whispered the girl, pointing to the dark interior of an adjoining room. "There's a conveyor belt that leads up to the ore reduction mill. You can climb the buckets and get up there. They won't have the mill surrounded." The masked rider and Blue Hawk slipped past the trembling girl, their eyes probing the blackness as Betty Noonan shut and padlocked the door behind them. Waiting for their eyes to accustom themselves to the darkness, the trapped men heard Ed Channon's quavering voice. "All right, Marshal. I'll open up and let you see for yourself. I can explain why they were here." Russ Pedersen's boots thumped into the office as the masked rider and Blue Hawk made out the dim outlines of a series of rusty iron conveyor buckets, which led up a boarded-in, sloping structure which led to the reduction mill running up the canyon slope. The conveyor belt made an ideal ladder, and the two fugitives climbed from bucket to bucket, skinning their hands on sharp bits of gold ore. Behind them, they heard the muffled yell of the mining camp marshal, addressing the cordon of regulators surrounding the office shack. "They ain't in here, men. Scatter and pick up sign around the shaft house and the stamp mill. Their hosses are still outside. They must be hiding somewheres close." With sweat raining from their pores and their muscles aching with effort, the masked rider and his Yaqui partner scrambled from bucket to bucket of the conveyor belt. Above them, they could see stars winking through cracks in the roof. "Marshal!" came the strident yell of Gus Asplin. "They run a Sandy on you. I got a hunch they're climbing the conveyor belt incline. We got to surround the stamp mill." With desperate haste, the masked rider leaped down from a conveyor bucket to land on the plank floor of the reduction plant. Blue Hawk followed him out of the conveyor chute, his moccasined feet landing as noiselessly as a panther. Groping their way through a maze of gigantic machinery, the outlaws threaded across the plant to where a door loomed gray against the dark interior. Men were yelling to each other on the mountainside beyond the stamp mill walls as they scrambled up toward the syndicate mill. Even as the masked rider reached the threshold of the open doorway, he saw the stocky-built figure of Gus Asplin scramble up to the stamp mill entrance, starshine winking off a twin-bored shotgun from the regulator's arsenal. "There's only 3 doors to the stamp mill, men," bawled Asplin. "Guard them, and we got them skunks trapped. We can hold them all night, and then—" Asplin's voice trailed off as he heard a plank squeak under a treading foot, dead ahead. Chapter 4. Box Canyon Trap. Staring into the murky maw of the stamp mill door, Asplin could see no sign of danger. The masked rider's black costume formed a perfect camouflage, and Blue Hawk, with his telltale white shirt, was remaining prudently inside. Walk. A clubbing gun barrel connected with Asplin's skull, and the traitorous engineer flopped insensible at the masked rider's feet. The Robin Hood outlaw snatched the shotgun from the reward hunter's limp fingers before it could rattle down the hillside to betray Asplin's fate. "Come on, Hawk," whispered the masked rider. "We got to reach our hosses." Straight down the steep canyon slope, the two fugitives made their way, keeping to the shadows under the stamp mill wall. Once they halted stock still, while 2 grunting regulators clawed their way past them, almost at arm's reach. Then, breaking into the open, the two outlaws sprinted past Shannon's office and raced up to their waiting horses. "There they go, men," screeched Marshal Russ Pedersen, leaping out of the lamplight-flooded doorway where Ed Shannon and Betty Noonan were standing. "They're giving us the slip." A bullet from one of the masked rider's .45s fanned the marshal's cheek, causing him to drop flat on his face to prevent silhouetting himself against the lamp-lighted doorway. The delay gave the two outlaws time to vault into saddles, and then they, with their extra horse that Betty Noonan had ridden galloping behind, were commenting into the protection of the pine forest. They were followed by a whistling blast of buckshot from Peterson's weapon, swarming leaden pellets which fell short of their targets as Blue Hawk and the masked rider made their getaway. Full moon wheeled over the Sierra Nevada crags by the time the wanted men had returned to the hideout where they had left their extra mounts, in the region of the redwood bulletin board tree. Behind them they could hear a distance-muted clatter of hoofs, the sound carrying far down the cliff-walled corridor of Roaring River's gorge. "Half of Placer Bar is in saddle, trying to get a cut of the bounty we're packing, Hawk," rasped out the masked rider as they tied on their packs aboard the roan and the pinto. "We'll have to get into the tall timber and keep moving until daylight." Out into the brilliant moonlight, the pair spurred their way, leading their pack horses and riding through the bulletin board tree once more, this time bound westward. Harsh lines of concern were etched on the masked rider's lean face as he heard the sounds of pursuit increasing in volume behind them. He was thinking of the miles of canyon trail they had ahead of them, before a side gulch broke the roaring river chasm to afford a means of escaping the canyon. They had ridden hard and far since daylight, and their horses were beginning to falter under the strain. On the other hand, the regulator posse pounding behind them were no doubt mounted on fresh horses. The vertical walls of the canyon gave way to a slanting, hopper-shaped formation, so heavily overgrown with pines and manzanita undergrowth that travel on horseback would be impossible off the river trail itself. Across Roaring River, the canyon was gashed with numerous side gullies, but the mountain torrent, bedded with fang-like rocks, would be too difficult to cross. They had purposely avoided taking the Mariposa Trail, which forked out of the Roaring River defile at the Bulletin Board Redwood, knowing from past experience that it was roof-steep and the chances were too great on being overtaken by the hard-riding regulators. The Mariposa Trail likewise climbed above timberline, and on the steep switchbacks, unprotected by trees, they would have made prime targets for posse guns. "If we can make it to where Muddy Creek enters the Roaring River, we're safe, Hawk," the masked rider flung back over his shoulder. "We have 100 square miles of big timber to hole up in along the Muddy. We've got to make our head start count before those Gold Camp Buscaderos cut down our lead to where they can spot us." Rounding a sweeping curve of the rocky canyon, the masked rider flung up an arm to warn Blue Hawk, pounding along at his heels, to rein up. Dead ahead on the trail, plainly revealed in the moonlight, was a plodding string of mules, flanked by buckskin-clad guards on horseback. The mules were laboring under diamond-hitched canvas packs, freighting supplies to the stores and saloons of Placer Bar. On the narrow trail, it would be impossible to pass the inbound mule train, and if the mule skinners caught a glimpse of the masked rider's costume, they would probably open fire without delay. Hastily backtracking around the bend of the trail to prevent being seen by the oncoming freighters, the masked rider and Blue Hawk held a hurried conference. At their south was a sheer wall of granite, backed by impenetrable forest. Behind them, a score or more of shotgun-armed regulators were speeding up from Placer Bar, bent on gunning them from their saddles. And further travel to the west was impossible without waiting for the mules to pass. "We're trapped, as things stand now, Hawk," bit out the Robin Hood outlaw. "We could abandon our hosses and climb up into the timber. But that would be plumb foolish. For once the regulators spotted our ponies, they could cut us off from the summit." Blue Hawk pointed off to the northward, across the plunging torrent of Roaring River. "There is a canyon, senor," the Indian said gravely. "It is our only chance." Of one accord, the two outlaws spurred their horses down the steep rocky incline toward the spot where lunar rainbows were playing in the foaming cascades at the foot of a long series of river rapids. "We'll be lucky if we cross the river without our hosses busting a leg or two," groaned the masked rider. "But like you say, there's nothing else we can do." A few moments later, their mounts were plunging into hock-deep water, hoofs fighting for purchase on the slippery stones, the icy river sluicing at mill-race speed down the rapids. Foot by foot, the four horses lurched and all but fell, picked up their feet again, and struggled on, buffeted by the churning waters and impeded by the sharp rocks under hoof. In belly-deep water at mid-river, the masked rider heard his Indian partner cry out sharply above the thunderous cascading of the rapids. Hipping about in saddle, the masked rider peered upward through the flying spray, and his jaw hardened in dismay. The regulator riders from Placer Bar were pounding around the canyon trail overhead and reining up as they spotted their quarry, braving the dangerous waters of Roaring River in the gorge below. Moonbeams glinted on shotgun barrels as the posse riders dismounted. Flames stabbed from gun muzzles, and buckshot sprayed the river, as Russ Pedersen gave the order to fire on the sorely beset fugitives. But the masked rider's luck held, and a moment later he and his Indian companion were spurring up the north bank, heading for the welcome shadows of the cliff-walled canyon immediately ahead. The startled muleteers, with their string of freight-laden animals, joined forces with the regulators, just as the masked rider and Blue Hawk vanished into the maw of the canyon. "They've sealed their own dooms, men," Russ Pedersen announced triumphantly. "That's Nugget Gulch, where the masked rider is going. It's only a half a mile long and ends in a blind box. We got 'em trapped, amigos." Undaunted by the barricade of rushing waters which cut them off from the mouth of the blind canyon, Pedersen and his regulators scrambled on foot down the slope and started wading the treacherous current. They were joined by the enthusiastic mule train guards, who saw a chance to enter an exciting manhunt and get their share of the reward posted for the famous masked rider's capture. Forming a living chain across Roaring River, the marshal and his husky regulators succeeded in gaining the north bank. Drenched from head to foot, the posse assembled on the river's edge to check their shotgun cartridges and examine holstered six-guns. Then, following Russ Pedersen, they converged on the bottleneck entrance of Nugget Gulch. Somewhere up the brushy defile ahead, the masked rider and his Indian partner were riding deeper and deeper into a trap. Being strangers to this section of the Sierra Nevadas, they would discover their mistake too late. Nothing short of wings would enable them to scale the beetling granite walls of the canyon offshoot. "Now, we'll handle it this away, men," Marshal Pedersen said when they were inside the shadowy throat of the box canyon. "The odds is around 40 again, too, so we won't have to worry about them slipping out of this trap. But the masked rider is a cagey one, and he'll be desprit." Glancing around at the faces about him, Pedersen grounded his shotgun butt and went on. We'll block the canyon from cliff to cliff. I want us to split up into 3 groups of around 15 men each, and we'll cork up this gulch from wall to wall. By some miracle, them 2 owl hooters might slip between the first bunch of men, but turn page, they'll have to face 2 other bunches. And it's impossible they could corkscrew their way through 3 walls of shotgun-totin' hombres. Barking sharp orders, Russ Pedersen headed off into the narrow, high-walled gulch, fanning out his regulators so that every foot of the canyon width was covered. After penetrating 50 yards up the canyon, beating the brush as thoroughly as if they were hunting jackrabbits, the marshal yelled a signal to the second squad of manhunters. They, too, spread out in a phalanx, fine-tooth combing the floor of the gulch. And they were followed, 50 yards behind, by an equally vigilant row of men, spanning the defile from cliff wall to cliff wall. Not even a field mouse could hope to filter through that triple wall of guards. Meanwhile, fighting their way through brisket deep brush, the Masked Rider and Blue Hawk were pushing deeper into the converging end of the gulch, their eyes narrowing with growing dread as they scanned the steep granite walls for some ledge or side fissure which would carry them up to the timber. Half an hour later, scratched and bleeding from the spiny chaparral they were breaking trail through, the fugitives drew rein, despair clawing at their hearts. This was trail's end. Ahead of them, the brush petered out onto a sandy clearing where prospectors had grubbed for gold in the gravelly canyon bed. And looming above them was an unscalable 100-foot wall of moon-gilded granite, the dead end of a box canyon. Out of the frying pan into the fire, Hawk, sighed the Masked Rider. I don't doubt but what them mining camp buskies cross the river and are standing guard at the mouth of this box canyon. Blue Hawk nodded gravely, his piercing eyes studying the rocky cul-de-sac and admitting defeat. For the first time since he had joined up in his bizarre partnership with the Robin Hood outlaw, sharing perils and triumphs with the same stoic calm, the Yaqui realized that he and the Masked Rider faced an impasse. Our hosses are ganted to the breaking point, Hawk, the Masked Rider said wearily. Hold 'em here, and I'll go back and do some scouting. Sliding out of stirrups, the black-cloaked outlaw vanished in the brush-down canyon. He has not gone 200 yards before he realized that their peril was far worse than he had imagined. For not only had Russ Pedersen led his regulators across the river to post a guard over the box canyon's exit, but the daring marshal was leading his manhunters in for the kill. Crouching in a madrone thicket, the Masked Rider saw a wall of men advancing slowly up through the moonlight, beating the brush with their shotgun muzzles, moving shoulder to shoulder toward the blind end of the canyon. On they came, stolidly silent, as determined and irresistible as a tidal wave of doom. And from the sound of crackling brush in the rear of the marshal's phalanx, the Masked Rider knew that a similar line of regulators was following in a second wave. In moments of supreme peril, the Masked Rider's nerves were always at their coolest, his hair-trigger brain most fertile and keenly attuned. Now, with doom's slow march beating up the canyon before him, the Masked Rider sized up the odds and realized his chances of breaking out of this trap were nil. From where he squatted in the underbrush, he knew he could pick off 1, 2, a dozen men. But never in his outcast career had the Robin Hood outlaw shot a lawman pursuing his duty. Never had the Masked Rider chosen the cowardly way out of a showdown by shooting from ambush. Chapter 5. Moonlight Mystery. There's 1,000,000 to 1 chance we can outwit these posse men in spite of the odds, Hawk, the masked rider said. You'll lay yourself open to a coward's bullet, maybe a hang rope, if you agree to my plan. But otherwise, the two of us face capture before the hour is out, and that capture means death. The Indian nodded bleakly in the moonlight. Sai, what is your plan, senor? As he outlined his daring scheme, the masked rider was busy removing his black cloak and domino mask. Replacing his soot-black Stetson for the rawhide lace-gray sombrero he carried in Midnight's Alforja pouches, the masked rider once more stood before Blue Hawk, transformed into his role of Wayne Morgan, rambling cowpuncher. Your scheme is bueno, the Yaqui agreed softly. Go. I remain here with the horses, senor. Valgame Dios. Impulsively, Morgan reached out to grip his comrade's lean, copper-brown hand. Both men knew, but would not admit it through any flicker of facial expression, that this might be their last goodbye. Hasta la vista, Hawk, and wish me luck. Turning, Wayne Morgan skulked off down the canyon, moon rays gleaming off the conchas on his bat-wing chaps. He kept going, straight in the direction of Marshal Pedersen and his regulators. One man against seemingly unsurmountable odds, gambling his destiny on his bold imagination and dauntless courage. With infinite caution, Wayne Morgan worked his way down canyon until he reached a spot where the cliff walls narrowed to less than 20 feet across. Broken talus boulders were piled thick at this point, the individual rocks overgrown with ignota brush and wild tobacco. Squirming into the boulder pile, Morgan had a view of the moon-drenched corridor of Nugget Gulch, curving off and away toward the river. He had reached the talus in the nick of time. Already, Marshal Pedersen and his Gold Camp possemen were beginning to work their way around the corner of the defile, shotguns held alert for emergency. Pedersen's low voice reached Morgan's ears. The masked riders probably reached the box end of the canyon by now. Hazeltine, can you hear me, Hazeltine? One of the posse riders, the publisher of the Placer Bar Mining News, his fingers still sticky with the fresh printer's ink he had been feeding to his press when Gus Asplin reached his office with the news of the masked riders' presence in the gold camp, answered from the north side of the phalanx. Here, Marshal. What you want? The line of advancing men halted as Russ Peterson scanned the boulder pile ahead of them. We gotta be careful we don't meet the masked rider and his engine pard hightailing back down the canyon, Hazeltine, Pedersen called to the editor. You and 4 or 5 men work your way easy-like into that talus yonder. From them rocks you can tell us if them owl hooters are in sight. Yo got a view clear to the end of the gulch from your angle. The regulators nearest Hazeltine bellied down on the rocks beside him and snaked their way cautiously into the talus pile, shoving rifles and shotguns ahead of them. Their eyes strained for the first glimpse around the bend of Nugget Gulch. A few yards ahead in the boulders, Wayne Morgan withdrew into a wide cleft where a huge boulder, dropping from the rim rock, had cracked in two. The moonlight did not penetrate the fissure, and the cowboy felt secure for the moment. Foot by foot, the newspaper editor and the remaining regulators crawled into the rocks, past Wayne Morgan's hiding place, and on around the bend of the canyon. When they were 10 feet beyond him, Wayne Morgan crawled out into the open on hands and knees, and drawing a 6-gun, started inching his way along behind Hazeltine. The moon cruised behind a fleecy cloud nest, and Morgan took his opportunity to crawl forward and join the regulators who were stalking him. When the moon burst into the open sky again and flooded the canyon with argent light, Wayne Morgan was belly down at Hazeltine's elbow, with a burly mule skinner from the inbound mule train less than a yard on his other side. Rearing to his knees, Hazeltine peered off up the canyon. Then, after a long moment's surveillance, the boom camp editor hunkered down once more alongside Morgan. "No trace of them owl hooters or their hosses, Marshal," the newspaperman called back to the waiting regulators. "It's all right to come on around the bend." Crouching there amid the rocks, Hazeltine glanced around, staring absently at the cowboy gunman who had crawled into the talus heap with him. It was the most perilous moment Morgan faced, but he knew his scheme was working when he saw Hazeltine's gaze return up the canyon. The posse, which had swarmed out of Placer Bar on the trail of the masked rider, had been composed of any man who had a horse handy for the chase. As a result, many of them were not regulator committee members and would be strangers to Hazeltine. In addition, the posse had been increased by the muleteers who had met them on the Roaring River Trail. For all Hazeltine knew, if he gave Morgan's presence at his elbow a second thought, which Morgan doubted, the cowboy stranger had been with the posse all along. A few minutes later, Russ Pedersen, his marshal's badge glinting in the moonlight, had crawled up past Hazeltine and the advance guard and was leading his regulators on up the canyon. As the cliff walls narrowed, Wayne Morgan found himself rubbing shoulders with gold miners and mule skinners, who accepted his presence among them without question. For half an hour, the slow forward progress proceeded as Pedersen closed the jaws of the man-trap on the two outlaws he believed were caught at the blind end of Nugget Gulch. At length, the marshal and his first body of regulators were burrowing through the last barrier of brush before coming into view of the clearing at Canyon's end. Wayne Morgan purposely jockeyed himself to a position alongside the boom camp marshal when Russ Pedersen parted the chaparral with his shotgun barrel and peered out toward the rocky cul-de-sac ahead. ROUR horses were grouped under the cliff, and with them was a lone Indian, apparently unaware that the posse was closing in on him. Wayne Morgan. Morgan breathed easier when he heard Pedersen mutter at his side, "That'll be Blue Hawk, and he ain't healed. But where in Tunket has the masked rider gone to?" Search as he might, the marshal saw no trace of the second outlaw. The cliff-boxed canyon end was devoid of vegetation, so that a man could not possibly be hiding anywhere around. But the Indian seemed to be alone. "Elevate, Redskin!" the Gold Camp marshal yelled suddenly, clicking the twin triggers of his buckshot gun to full cock. "You're covered!" Blue Hawk spun around to stare at the bulwark of brush from whence the order had come. Then his arms jerked aloft, and a look of well-feigned horror crossed the Yaquis' hatchet face. At a signal from Pedersen, the foremost regulators charged out of the brush, spanning the canyon from wall to wall, their guns covering Blue Hawk from a dozen angles. Wayne Morgan was matching Pedersen's stride as the marshal whipped out a pair of handcuffs and, charging Blue Hawk warily, snapped the fetters on the Indian's wrists. In a trice, the regulators had circled the four horses and were staring bewilderedly about in quest of the masked rider. Jabbing his shotgun into Blue Hawk's ribs, Pedersen demanded harshly, "All right, Blue Hawk, we know the masked rider come up this canyon with you. Where's he hiding?" Blue Hawk's flinty eyes ranged over the hostile faces of the regulators before him, passing over Wayne Morgan's face without a hint of recognition. "Quien sabe?" returned the Indian. "He is not here. Perhaps he took wings like an eagle and flew out of this trap. No?" A bead of sweat coasted down Pedersen's blade-thin nose. Bewilderment creased the marshal's seamy face as he stared around the rock-walled trap, glancing up the cliffs as if he expected to see the black-cloaked rider scaling the granite scarp like a fly. Heading through the ranks of his men, Pedersen halted a few yards down the canyon, and his lusty yell bounded in echo down the rocky corridor. "Come on up, men, and curry every bush and rock as you come. It's beginning to look like the masked riders give us the slip, impossible as it seems." Within 5 minutes, the entire personnel of the Placer Bar posse was congregated in the dead-end enclosure. They reported no clue as to the masked rider's whereabouts. "This is the masked rider's hoss," snarled Hazeltine, circling the big stallion. "Midnight, the reward posters call him. Marshal, this Injun knows where his part is. Threaten to shoot him if he won't talk." Pedersen turned angrily to the handcuffed Yaqui and seemed on the verge of carrying out the newspaperman's suggestion. Then he inhaled deeply and shook his head. "You don't know Injuns like I do, Hazeltine," groaned the lawman. "We could burn him alive, and he wouldn't tell on his partner. What galls me is that the masked rider could pull a Sandy like this on 40-odd men." An excited cry from the editor drew the posse's attention to where Hazeltine was unbuckling Midnight's saddle pockets. Out of the saddlebags, Hazeltine drew a black beaver Stetson, a domino mask with an elastic headband, and a thick cloak of black-dyed fabric. "Here's the masked rider's clothes, Marshal," cried the editor. "You know what? That outlaw stripped off his disguise, and he must be among us this minute." Pedersen and his regulators made sharp outcries at this startling bit of news. Wayne Morgan saw the possemen staring at their neighbors, peering at moonlit faces, fingering gun butts nervously. "Blamed if you ain't right, Hazeltine," snarled the Tin Star. "Without his black mask and cloak, nobody knows what the masked rider looks like. But we'll plumb soon find out if he's among us. I got an idea." Bawling sharp orders, Pedersen ranked the possemen into a long line, extending in a horseshoe-shaped file around the dead end of the canyon. Then, like a sergeant inspecting soldiers, Pedersen marched along the row of men, staring at each face in turn. "I'm picking out the strangers in this bunch," clipped the marshal. "Regulators from town, I know, and I know most of you mule freighters by sight. But the strangers, I want to step out of line where we can get a look at you." One by one, Pedersen selected 4 men from the posse whom he could not recall having seen at the diggings before. At the end of the line, he picked out Wayne Morgan, who wore a complacent grin as he stepped out to join the quartet of strangers. Heading toward them, Morgan saw something which brought sweat dripping from his pores. For one of the men, a bullet-headed German by his looks, with a black shoebrush pompadour and a bull-thick neck, was Betty Noonan's escaped kidnapper. There could be no mistaking the ugly, bent-nosed visage he had seen on the trail by the bulletin board tree a few hours ago. The outlaw Betty Noonan believed was plotting the robbery of Ed Channon's payroll money had joined the Gold Camp posse to hunt down the masked rider tonight. What was his game now? Chapter 6. One-Man Horse. A glance at Blue Hawk told Wayne Morgan that the Indian, too, had recognized the escaped kidnapper in the ranks of the posse, for a flash of understanding passed between the handcuffed Yaqui and his partner. In the surprise of his discovery, Wayne Morgan was barely conscious of Marshal Russ Pedersen herding the 5 strangers into a line, and of the other regulators breaking ranks to crowd about them. "All right," bellowed the lawman, planting himself wide-legged before the 5 strangers. "You gents introduce yourselves and tell us who you are and what you're doing in this posse. I got a hunch one of you is the masked rider." The first man on the left, facing Pedersen, cleared his throat and croaked hoarsely. I'm Torvald Tronson, Marshal. I got a gold claim at the upper end of Roarin' River Canyon. Reckon I can prove that when we get back to Placer Bar. Wayne Morgan saw the marshal wave Tronson aside and turned to the next stranger. For the second man was Betty Noonan's kidnapper. My name's Sam Eichner, the outlaw said gruffly. I'm a prospector. Come up from Chinese camp last week and got a job at August Mangel's mine over on Granite Creek. The marshal turned toward the masked regulators about him. Mangel's ain't in this posse, is he? So's he can identify this Sam Eichner, Jasper? Mangel's was not present, the marshal was informed. Wayne Morgan found himself wondering if August Mangels was the name of one of Eichner's two kidnapped partners who had died before the blazing guns of the masked rider a few hours before. Until you and Tronson identify yourselves positive, you can consider yourselves under arrest. Pedersen rasped at the German. All right, we got 3 strangers left. Speak up. The 2 possemen at Wayne Morgan's right gave their names as Tom Nazel and Fred Nima, and claimed to be tin-horn gamblers working in various Placer Bar saloons. One left, Pedersen said, turning to Wayne Morgan. You ain't a miner, young feller, from the looks of them buckaroo duds. What's a cowboy doing in my posse tonight? Morgan shrugged, feeling the wave of tension which swept through the nervous crowd of miners about him. My name's Wayne Morgan, sir. I'm from Nevada, or wherever I can find a spread to rent my lass's rope. What you doing in California? Morgan grinned disarmingly. I was on my way to the Salinas country. Happened to be in Placer Bar tonight when I heard the town was organizing a posse to chase the masked rider. So I forked my bronc and come along, Marshal. Any objections? Pedersen shoved back his Stetson and scratched his bald head thoughtfully. No objections at all, cowboy. Unless I prove you're the masked rider. And I figure I got a way to find out if you or one of these other buskies are. Excitement swept through the crowd as they saw Marshal Pedersen stride past the 5 strangers who had to prove themselves innocent of suspicion of being the masked rider. Going over to where a mule skinner was holding the 4 horses belonging to the captured outlaws, the Gold Camp lawman returned with the masked rider's magnificent black stallion, Midnight. This here hoss, Pedersen said, is a one-man hoss. In other words, nobody but his owner, the masked rider, can ride Midnight. I got that information from sheriff's circulars mailed to my office. And on that basis, I aim to find out which of you gents Tronson, Eichner, Nazel, Nima, or Morgan is the ringy skunk who's masquerading as one of us possemen. Cold fingers of dread seized Wayne Morgan's heart at that moment. Pedersen's information had been correct. Midnight was indeed a one-man stallion. Even Blue Hawk could not ride the magnificent black, unless the masked rider ordered Midnight to be docile under the Yaquis' reining. Flicking a glance at the handcuffed Yaqui, Morgan saw despair kindling in his partner's eyes. Blue Hawk realized that the masked rider's desperate plan was about to boomerang and bring about their doom. It had been Wayne Morgan's original idea to join the regulators and help capture Blue Hawk, who had been coached to put up no resistance when the showdown came. Then Morgan had figured that the Gold Camp miners would figure that the masked rider had somehow escaped the trap, and they would head back to Placer Bar with their Indian prisoner. Morgan figured on rescuing Blue Hawk from Pedersen's jail by some method, but now it seemed that the wily marshal had outwitted him. Knowing that Midnight was a one-man horse, Pedersen had struck on an idea which would prove the masked rider's identity beyond the shadow of a doubt. "By jingoes, we gotta hand it to you, Russ," ejaculated Hazelton, the editor. Have your guns ready, boys, in case one of these 5 strangers tries to shoot out of this trap." Grinning jubilantly, Russ Pedersen turned to Morgan. "You're dressed for riding, Morgan," snapped the officer. "Suppose you straddle Midnight first." Heart beating like a trip hammer, Wayne Morgan advanced toward his black stallion, approaching from the rear so that the magnificent animal would not nuzzle his shoulder affectionately. "Stand back, men," ordered Pedersen, "just in case Midnight does some plain and fancy bucking." Gripping reins and saddle horn, Wayne Morgan swung into Midnight's stirrups. The stallion's offside was in shadow, the moonlight streaming down from the opposite angle. And even as his body settled into the cantleboard, Morgan hooked his big Chihuahua spurs hard into Midnight's flank. Unaccustomed to the prick of steel, Midnight snorted angrily and reared on his hind legs. Twice again, Morgan rowelled the black, the movement of his cowboot unnoticed by the excited regulators. Taking the bit in his teeth, the high-spirited stallion bogged his head down and started sunfishing like an untamed fuzztail. Rocking in saddle, Wayne Morgan felt his gray Stetson fly into the air. Regulators yelled excitedly as they saw the waddy grab leather and fight to keep his stirrups. Then, bucking furiously, Midnight arched his back, and Wayne Morgan went tail over Tincup to land with a jarring smash on the rocks at Marshal Pedersen's feet. Dazed and gasping, Morgan felt the lawman help him to his feet. Shaking his head in feigned grogginess, Morgan turned to scan the snorting black as Midnight pawed the rocks angrily with a steel-shod hoof. "That's the first nag that ever piled me," gasped Morgan. "Darned if I wouldn't like to own the masked rider's horse. I'd break him to Har-Blue Hawk Ness, 'fore I was finished." Roars of laughter greeted the waddy's announcement, and Morgan felt the marshal pumping his hand. "Not guilty," chuckled the lawman. "You can be glad you didn't stick on Midnight's saddle, Morgan, under the circumstances." Morgan brushed past Blue Hawk as he lurched over to the snorting stallion and seized Midnight's bit ring. He heard the Yaqui exhale his pent-up breath and knew his partner was inwardly exulting over the clever ruse his comrade had pulled. "All right, Sam Eichner, you're next," rasped the marshal. "Hang on to them reins, Morgan, until this crowd has a try at sticking in Midnight's saddle." A steely hush settled over the regulators as Betty Noonan's escaped kidnapper approached the horse gingerly. "This test ain't fair," croaked Eichner. "This hoss may be bucked out. If he sets still with me on him, it don't prove I'm the masked rider." Pedersen shook his head grimly. "Get astride, Eichner. I got a hunch Midnight could buck off this whole posse, one after the other. If you ain't the masked rider, you got nothing to worry about, except picking a soft spot to land." All eyes were trained on Sam Eichner. As the gun-slung stranger took the reins, which Wayne Morgan handed him, and reached up to fit a stirrup to a hobnailed boot toe, and because the posseman's attention was riveted to the next candidate to ride Midnight, they did not see the waddy Wayne Morgan pull the black's head down and whisper into the stallion's ear. "Easy, boy," Morgan said, patting Midnight's muzzle. "Easy." The highly trained stallion tried to nuzzle its master as Morgan stepped away. Obedient to his owner's voice to an uncanny degree, trained as few mounts had been trained, Midnight completely ignored the German prospector who was clambering aboard. Jaws dropped open in amazement as Sam Eichner settled into the saddle. Midnight did not flicker an eyelash. The color bleached from Eichner's stubbled face as he stared down at the beautiful arched neck of the horse between his knees, as if imploring Midnight to buck his hardest. But the animal remained motionless, as a statue carved in ebony. "No! No!" screamed Eichner, his eyes rolling in terror. "This ain't fair. I'm being framed by a mangy fuzztail. This hoss ain't a one-man nag. It's all bucked out, I tell you." Eichner hammered the black's ribs with his high-laced boots, but Midnight remained as docile as a wooden image. Marshal Pedersen's jaw locked grimly as he motioned Sam Eichner to dismount. "We'll try Nima and Tronson and Nazel," the lawman said, "just to make sure there ain't any mistake. Hazeltine, shove a gun in Eichner's belly and take his smoke poles." Eichner was livid with terror and rage as the editor came forward to take his 6 guns from holsters. Then, berserk, Eichner made the mistake of swinging on Hazeltine. Instantly, Wayne Morgan and 2 other posse men had seized the frantic outlaw and pinioned his arms to his side. In rapid succession, Torvald Tronson and Tom Nazel and Fred Nima attempted to ride Midnight, but in each case the horse bucked like a man-killer, and the 3 suspects were catapulted summarily into the discard. "Eichner's the masked rider," Pedersen bawled above the pandemonium of voices. "A hoss couldn't lie." Striding over to where Blue Hawk was standing, eyes averted, the marshal thrust a 6-gun into the Yaki's side. "All right, Redskin," he demanded savagely. "You seen Midnight's performance? Are you sticking by that hoss's judgment? Are you admitting Sam Eichner is your pard, the masked rider?" Blue Hawk looked up, his eyes sad and despairful as he stared at Sam Eichner. "Tell him the truth, you red-skinned sidewinder," screamed Eichner. "Tell him I ain't the masked rider." Time seemed to stand still in the box canyon as Blue Hawk inhaled deeply and shook his head slowly from side to side. "The jig is up, senor," the Yaqui told Sam Eichner. "There is no use for me to lie, amigo. These men know you are the masked rider. The blame must go on Midnight." Wayne Morgan felt Eichner sway under his grasp as if he were about to drop. Before the outraged German could protest, the voice of Marshal Pedersen broke up the posse meeting. "Let's go, men. Back to Placer Bar to hold a kangaroo court over Blue Hawk and the masked rider. I reckon our work is done." Chapter 7. Sentenced to stretch rope. Wayne Morgan made the trip back to the gold camp on foot, thankful that in the excitement of their victory, the regulators had not noticed that their cowboy associate did not have a saddle horse waiting back in the cavvy at the mouth of Nugget Gulch. His own mounts had been taken into custody by the marshal. But the discrepancy went unnoticed, and Morgan merely bided his time until the regulators had headed eastward up the Rimrock Trail, followed by the string of freight-laden mules. Then, the cowboy had set out on foot for Placer Bar. He arrived in the gold camp shortly before dawn to find every saloon in town doing a booming business. Each bar had its share of regulators who had joined in the capture of the masked rider, and eager to tell their cronies about the dramatic part the Black Stallion, Midnight, had played in the famous outlaw's capture. Mingling freely with the sidewalk throngs, Wayne Morgan soon learned that Blue Hawk and Sam Eichner had been lodged in the red brick jailhouse overlooking the town. Gossip had it that the masked rider was insane with rage against his Indian companion for double-crossing him in a pinch, and to keep the 2 ex-partners from each other's throats, Marshal Pedersen had been forced to lodge his prisoners in separate cells. August Mangels, owner of the Butterfly Mine out on Granite Creek, had been in town when the posse returned, and Pedersen had immediately confronted the mine boss with Sam Eichner's statement that he worked as a mucker on Mangel's diggings. "Never saw him before in my life," Mangels was quoted as saying when the supposed masked rider was brought before him. Or if I had hired him, Marshal, I wouldn't known he was the masked rider. Hunting out a restaurant on the main street, Wayne Morgan appeased his ravenous appetite, at the same time keeping his eyes and ears open. News was already going through the mining camp that the masked rider and his Indian partner would be given a fair trial at the regulator's kangaroo court session to convene tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock in the Placer Bar courthouse. Bets were being laid that the famous outlaws would stretch hemp before another sunset. "This guy Eichner keeps claiming he's been framed," Morgan overheard a patron tell the restaurant man. "But being the masked rider, he'd sure claim he wasn't. Seems Eichner can't prove he ain't the masked rider either. Nobody in Placer Bar ever seen him before, including August Mangels. And Eichner claimed he worked at Mangel's Diggins. Though he was exhausted from lack of sleep and the ordeal he had gone through in the past 12 hours, Wayne Morgan scouted around long enough to discover that Midnight and the other 3 horses had been lodged in the county jail stables. Following the legal disposure of their owners, the marshal had announced the 4 horses would be sold at public auction. In the black hour before the sunrise, Wayne Morgan located the county stables in the rear of the barred-windowed jailhouse where Eichner and Blue Hawk were being held prisoner. As he passed the calaboose, Morgan was amused to hear Sam Eichner beating at his cell door and screaming oaths at Blue Hawk in another cell. "You blasted Injun," Eichner was howling. "You heathen liar! You know that Midnight hoss played a trick on me, letting me ride him. You gotta tell the truth at that kangaroo court trial, or I'll stretch hang rope." Going back to the stable, Morgan found it unguarded. He paused a moment at Midnight's stall to pet the stallion. Then he rummaged along the row of saddles hanging from wall pegs until he found his own. When he left the stable, he was carrying his masked rider's costume in Midnight's saddlebags slung over his shoulder. He might have use for that costume before the day was over. Inquiry disclosed that the only hotel in town was a ramshackle 2-story building near the Eagle Syndicate's stamp mill. It was known as Mrs. Bremer's boarding house. There, Morgan rented a room for the night and, hiding his saddlebags in a closet, turned in for a few hours' sleep just as the sun's first rays were pouring through the window. It was high noon when Wayne Morgan awoke, refreshed, but brooding mentally over the grim task which lay before him. What fate overtook Sam Eichner, Morgan was not worrying about, for the German was obviously an owl hooter and a killer wolf. But Blue Hawk, it was unthinkable that he could permit his Yaqui partner to meet a gallows finish. Blue Hawk had gladly submitted to arrest, putting a blind trust in his partner to rescue him when the time was ripe. Morgan's future actions were dependent on the outcome of this afternoon's kangaroo court meeting. After a bath and a shave, Wayne Morgan went downstairs to eat in Mrs. Bremer's dining room. The Waddy was seated opposite Ed Channon and Betty Noonan, and the young couple seemed occupied with their own thoughts. "What I told the marshal about the masked riders saving your life yesterday won't mean a thing in the courtroom, dear," the syndicate payroll clerk told his fiancée. Wayne Morgan saw a tear roll down Betty Noonan's cheek as she dabbled at her food. "But those 2 men will go to their dooms on my account, Ed," she protested. "That's what kept me awake all night after I heard they had been captured. To think that I was indirectly responsible for the masked rider's capture, it's maddening." Leaving their meal half finished, Betty and Ed Channon left the boarding house. Their eyes had met Wayne/Morgan's, but it was obvious that they saw no connection between the handsome cowboy stranger at their table and the masked man who had rescued the girl from Sam Eichner and his kidnappers the day before. On a hunch, Wayne Morgan headed for the Placer Bar courthouse an hour in advance of the regulator's trial. He found the courtroom already well filled, and it was only with difficulty that he managed to find standing room in the rear of the hall. Promptly at 2 o'clock, a buzz of excitement swept the packed room as 12 regulators, chosen for jury duty, filed into their box. Excitement became a raucous bedlam when a rear door of the courtroom opened and Marshal Russ Pedersen entered with Blue Hawk and Sam Eichner, both prisoners handcuffed and under a heavy guard. Since the only law in the diggings was that of Pedersen and his regulators, ordinary rules of legal procedure were dispensed with, and in the absence of a circuit judge, Pedersen himself occupied the bench. Sam Eichner's bloated face was gray and mottled, his eyes redimmed from a sleepless night in the Placer Bar jail. Blue Hawk, on the other hand, had rested well. The Indian's eyes roved over the jammed spectators, finally picking out Wayne Morgan in the rear of the room. The cowboy nodded imperceptibly and saw Hawk's tense expression relax. "This kangaroo court is now in session." Russ Pedersen silenced the clamor by hammering the bench with the butt of a 6-gun. The prisoners before the bar of justice are too well known to merit any long-winded explanation of who they are. I reckon everybody west of the Pecos has heard of the Masked Rider and Blue Hawk. Sam Eichner lurched to his feet, his handcuffs rattling in the silence. "I ain't the Masked Rider," he choked out hoarsely. "If August Mangels don't speak up and tell the truth, I'll spill the reason why I am in this gold camp." Wayne Morgan's eyes flashed with interest, as he alone in the smoke-clouded room caught the significance of Eichner's outburst. Was August Mangels, the butterfly mine owner, mixed up in Betty Noonan's abortive kidnap attempt of the day before and the proposed payroll robbery? There was a bustle in the forepart of the spectators, and Morgan saw a beefy man with a bandage wrapped around his head swing around the corner of the defense table and stoop to whisper something in Eichner's ear. Whatever it was, Eichner relaxed into his seat. When the whisperer turned to go back to the spectator section, Wayne Morgan recognized the bandaged face of Gus Asplin, the syndicate engineer who had betrayed the Masked Rider's presence in Ed Shannon's office. "Just a minute, Asplin," roared the marshal. "What did you just say to the Masked Rider?" Asplin turned to face the bench. I was telling him to be sure and bring out that it was me who was responsible for his capture, even if I was knocked out and couldn't go along with the posse last night, Marshal." Asplin's quavering voice reached the end of the courtroom. "That was all. I want to make sure I get the reward for the Masked Rider's capture." Laughter and jeers swept through the courtroom as Asplin wriggled back to his seat. "No more whispering to the prisoners, or I'll fine you for contempt of court," Pedersen rumbled. "You'll get your share of the Masked Rider's bounty money, Asplin, and lose the respect of every man in Placer Bar to boot." The trial, such as it was, did not last long. Eichner, called to testify in his own defense, continued to deny stubbornly that he was the Masked Rider. Blue Hawk, however, contradicted the ugly German, insisting the Eichner had been his companion in outlawry for years. The marshal, referring to a number of reward posters on his bench, some of them yellowed with age, told off a number of crimes ticketed to the Masked Rider, and then sent the Placer Bar jury out of the room. When the regulators returned, it was only 3 o'clock. The entire trial had lasted but 40 minutes by the clock. Hazeltine, acting as foreman of the vigilante jury, got to his feet, and announced in the death-like hush, "It goes without saying that we found the defendants, Blue Hawk and Masked Rider, guilty on all charges, red agin 'em. The regulators leave sentence up to your discretion, Marshal." Wayne Morgan leaned forward tensely as he saw burly deputies haul Blue Hawk and the struggling, swearing Sam Eichner before the bar of justice to receive sentence. "It is the ruling of this court," Marshal Russ Pedersen intoned judicially, "that having been found guilty, the Masked Rider and Blue Hawk will be hanged by the neck until dead." A flurry of excitement swept the courtroom, almost drowning out the words Wayne Morgan was most anxious to hear. Tomorrow at sunrise, at the official hanging tree at the east end of Placer Bar. Now courts adjourned, sine die. Night fell over Placer Bar and found the California gold town overcrowded with miners. News had spread up and down the Motherlode diggings concerning the sensational capture and trial of the Masked Rider, and every jackleg muckler and gold-panning prospector within a 30-mile radius of the town abandoned his sluice box and cradle to be on hand for the morrow's double hanging. Not since 1851, when members of Joaquin Murrieta's gang of cutthroats had met their doom under the gnarled live oak hang tree in Placer Bar, had the diggings been treated to celebrities of the caliber of the Masked Rider and Blue Hawk. Chapter 8. Guns of the Masked Rider. Shortly after nightfall, Betty Noonan left her room at Mrs. Bremer's boarding house and made her way up the hillside to her fiancé's office at the Eagle Mining Syndicate Mills. She found Ed Channon pacing the floor in an agony of suspense. "I know, you're worrying about why no mention was made at the trial of the Masked Rider saving me from those kidnappers yesterday," the girl said, when Channon had placed a chair for her. "That surely proves, to us at least, that the Masked Rider isn't the craven killer he is painted to be." Channon buried his face in his hands. "We know the Masked Rider and his Indian partner are on the level, Betty," groaned the payroll clerk. "Last night, before Gus Asplin brought the regulators around to capture the Masked Rider, they proved their honesty." The young couple lapsed into a moody silence, their eyes drawn to the Eagle Syndicate's small safe in Channon's office. 24 hours ago, almost to the minute, that safe had been opened in the Masked Rider's presence, and the Robin Hood outlaw had helped Channon wrap the payroll currency in a bundle of dynamite sticks as a means of thwarting the potential robbery of the safe. During that time, prior to the arrival of Russ Pedersen and his regulators, the Masked Rider could easily have whipped out his guns and stolen the syndicate payroll. But Channon, trusting the two outlaws even as Betty had done, had opened the safe and revealed the treasure of currency without fear. That alone was indicative of the Masked Rider's inherent trustworthiness in Channon's estimation. "There's absolutely nothing we can do, Betty," the payroll clerk said despairingly. "As one of the regulators, I've got to stand my shift at guarding the jail tonight. I relieve Hazeltine at 12 o'clock. Betty Noonan crossed the floor and knelt at her fiancé's side, gripping Channon's hands impulsively. "You'll be guarding the jail at midnight?" she asked anxiously. "Then, couldn't you unlock the Masked Rider's cell? Make it look as if accomplices from the outside had done the job?" Channon shook his head. "No, honey. Russ Pedersen's taking no chances. He's got the jail surrounded with guards. The marshal isn't running the risk of a possible lynching bee. Besides, it is well known that the Masked Rider has no other friend than Blue Hawk. He doesn't run with a wolf pack like some outlaws do. A soft rap at the door caused Betty Noonan to jump to her feet. She remained at the desk, while Ed Channon went to the door. An instant later, she heard Channon cry out in astonishment as into the room slipped a familiar figure clad in coal-black Stetson, domino mask, and flowing cloak. "The Masked Rider," Betty whispered sharply. "Then you have escaped." The Masked Rider stepped over to the window and pulled down the blind. Then he turned, facing the dumbfounded couple with a flashing smile. "No, it's a long story, folks, but the Masked Rider wasn't captured in Nugget Gulch last night. But that Dutchman at the kangaroo court trial, Eigner." The Masked Rider laughed softly. "Eigner," he explained, "was the kidnapper who got away from us yesterday, Miss Noonan. You remember I saw his face when his mask fell away. That was why Blue Hawk pretended to the regulators that Sam Eigner was me. He figured Eigner deserved to swing." Betty Noonan and Ed Channon continued to stare at the Robin Hood outlaw as if they were seeing a ghost. But the Masked Rider's modulated voice was unmistakably that of the Western Cavalier who had rescued her from the kidnap trio the day before. "But I don't savvy how you pulled a trick like that on Sam Eigner," protested the payroll clerk. The Masked Rider seated himself on the desk, spinning a six-gun on its trigger guard. Channon had no way of knowing that the Masked Rider's guns were likewise the guns of Wayne Morgan, the cowboy who had eaten lunch across the table from them that day. In keeping with his dual role, the Masked Rider had seen to it that Wayne Morgan's clothing and six guns were inconspicuous. "There isn't time to explain everything now," the Masked Rider evaded. "I have come to you because you two are the only people in Placer Bar who trust me. You see, Blue Hawk is my pard, and he's sentenced to be hanged tomorrow at sunrise." Ed Channon spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "Betty and I have been racking our brains trying to figure out some way to get Blue Hawk and you, Sam Eigner, out of jail," the payroll clerk said. "It's no use. Marshal Pedersen has the place under heavy guard." The Masked Rider smiled enigmatically. "I know," he said. "I happened to overhear, outside before I knocked at the door, that you're relieving Mr. Hazeltine at midnight as one of the guards. Less than an hour ago, I visited the jail and saw that our newspaper editor is stationed at the front door of the jail. You'll be there?" Channon nodded, frowning uncertainly. "Then maybe it won't strain your conscience too much," the Masked Rider proposed. "If I visit you, say, around 2 o'clock in the morning, I'll make it appear that I slugged you in the dark and tied you up. Then I'll go inside and rescue Blue Hawk and leave Sam Eigner in his cell. The town's particular interested in seeing the Masked Rider hanged, not the Indian." Channon's eyes lighted eagerly. Then his expression was wiped off by a frown of dismay. "It still can't be done, Masked Rider. Marshal Pedersen has the keys to the cell Blue Hawk is in. He wouldn't turn over the keys to any of the jail guards." A weighty silence fell over the trio. It was broken by a glad cry from Betty Noonan, who jumped from her chair and headed for the door. "Wait here," she said. "I'll be back in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. I think, perhaps, I can pay in some measure for what you did for me yesterday evening, Masked Rider." Without further explanation, the girl vanished into the night. "I sure hope she knows what she's doing," the Masked Rider laughed. He glanced at the syndicate safe. "The payroll still there? You haven't seen any suspicious characters hanging around today, looking over your office shack?" Channon shook his head. "No, the payroll is raped in dynamite sticks, as you suggested, and the remaining space in the safe is packed with dynamite. If a burglar tried to blow up that strongbox, he'll wreck the whole place." 15 minutes elapsed before Betty Noonan flushed and panting, returned to the office. Then, holding her golden head proudly, she marched across the room and tossed into the masked rider's lap a massive iron key. "What in—" "The key to Blue Hawk's cell," Betty said exultantly. "It's a duplicate to the one Marshal Pedersen carries in his pocket." Channon and the masked rider stared at the key in amazement. It can't be possible," exclaimed the payroll clerk. "I've known Russ Pedersen for years. I know he couldn't possibly be talked into releasing a prisoner this way." Betty shook her head, her eyes dancing. "I got that key from Russ's wife," she explained. "Ethel Pedersen has been like a mother to me. I teach her children in school. She even got me my teacher's job here in Placer Bar. That key will unlock any cell in the entire jail." "But how?" protested Channon. "I explained the setup and told Ethel what the masked rider did with those kidnappers," the girl said. "I swore her to secrecy, and in return, she gave me one of her husband's duplicate keys. The rest is up to you, Ed, and the masked rider." The Robin Hood outlaw slid off the desk and pocketed the key. Heading for the door, he paused to bestow a warm smile of gratitude at the smiling pair. "Our score is even, Miss Noonan," the masked rider said. "Hasta luego. I'll see you at the jail later tonight, Channon." The man of mystery vanished into the night. When 12 o'clock struck from the courthouse tower clock, Ed Channon presented himself at the Placer Bar jail, where Hazeltine, publisher of the Weekly Mining News, was seated on the jailhouse steps, a shotgun cradled across his knees. "You'll stand guard till 4 o'clock in the morning, Ed," Hazeltine said, relinquishing the buckshot gun to the new guard. "If you see any of them barflies coming up to the jail, yell a warning to the regulators guarding the back entrance. Pedersen ain't expecting no lynch talk, but he wants us to be on the alert." Hazeltine plodded off into the darkness to get a few hours' sleep before being on hand at the town hang tree at sunrise. Ed Channon settled himself at the jail door and waited for time to pass. 2 o'clock had struck from the courthouse clock before the masked rider materialized from the darkness as if by magic. So quietly had he approached the jail that Channon was on his feet, fingers on shotgun triggers, when he heard the Robin Hood outlaws whisper, "All set, Channon?" The payroll clerk nodded, his pulses racing. "Sta bueno. I'll rope you up hand and foot, Channon, to make this look natural. I hate to do it, but I'll have to knock some skin off your jaw when I'm finished." Channon gulped hard. "Sock me a good wallop, masked rider," he said, reaching out to grip the mystery rider's hand. "It's little enough to do for Blue Hawk and you." Working swiftly, the masked rider bound up the jail guard with the lariat he had carried with him. "I visited the stables at midnight and got our 4 hosses out into the timber without anybody knowing what happened," the black-clad outlaw whispered. "We'll let the punch in the chin wait until Blue Hawk has thanked you, son," headed on tiptoe for the front door. "You are a worker of miracles, amigo." The two paused at the front steps, where Ed Channon lay in his bonds. A whispered word of explanation from the masked rider, and Blue Hawk knelt to squeeze the payroll clerk's shoulder in appreciation for his cooperation in the jailbreak. "When you and Miss Noonan exchange your vows," the masked rider whispered, "you might mail a letter to a certain Sam Jones in Las Vegas, alias Hode Perling." The masked rider daringly impersonates a killer and uncovers the nest of sidewinders that are menacing the town of Malpais in Bullet Harvest for renegades. An exciting complete masked rider novel by Charles N. Heckelman, coming next issue. Slipping through the door of Pedersen's office, The masked rider groped his way into the cell block. Raucous snores came from one of the cells, telling that Sam Eichner had at last succumbed to exhaustion and was dead to the world. "Senor," Blue Hawk's whisper guided the masked rider to the Indian cell. Taking the key which Betty Noonan had obtained for him, the Robin Hood outlaw opened the cell lock cautiously to prevent waking up Sam Eichner. A moment later, the two partners were shaking hands warmly in the darkness. "I knew you would be here tonight, Senor," whispered the Yaqui, as they, Nevada, Care General Delivery. "Got that?" Shannon nodded. "Adios," he whispered. "I don't reckon we'll ever forget what you've..." "Walk." A grazing blow of the masked rider's fist brought a well of blood from Shannon's jaw. The payroll clerk sagged back, dazed by the punch which would eliminate him from suspicion when Blue Hawk's escape was discovered by the Gold Camp Marshal. Before Shannon's brain had a chance to clear, Blue Hawk and the masked rider were melting into the night on their way to their waiting horses, back in the safety of the pines.